I welcome you all to the module 6 of the course titled Applied Positive Psychology. So, we are discussing module 6. So, module 6 is about resilience and post-traumatic growth. So, today is lecture number 17 and it is second lecture of the module 6. So, today we will be talking about the concept of post-traumatic growth. We will be focusing on some of the theoretical concepts and then we will talk about some of the possible interventions. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture, which was also part of the same module. So, the last lecture was about the concept of resilience. In two parts of this lecture, we discussed elaborately about the various concepts associated with the resilience. So, we defined what is resilience. We also discussed the different trends of research in terms of waves of research in the field of resilience. We also talked about some of the foundational studies on resilience, which set the stage for different waves of research. We also discussed how resilience is connected with various positive psychology concepts, and at the end we discussed how can we build resilience using an example of a skill-based model. So, these are some of the things that we have discussed in the last lecture. So, today we will be talking about the concept of post-traumatic growth. In short, it is called as PTG. And we will be talking about some of the related concepts. We will also talk about different domains of post-traumatic growth. We will also talk about what kind of traumatic events leads to post-traumatic growth. We will also discuss some of the models of PTG, and then we will discuss some of the literature or empirical findings associated with PTG, well-being and wisdom. And at the end, we will talk about how to facilitate post-traumatic growth. So, let us start today's lecture. So, when we talk about post-traumatic growth, so as the name suggests, it's something that happens after the trauma. Now, when a person experiences a traumatic event or a challenging event or a adversity in one's life, so there are many possible outcomes that can happen depending on how the person is dealing with the situation. So, when we face a traumatic event or a very difficult situation or a adversity in life, so some of the possibilities are listed in this graph. So, when we talk about this line is like the baseline functioning of a person. So, this is the level of functioning the person is, let us say before the event, what is the level of functioning of a person. So, this line indicates that functioning level. Now, when a trauma events or something negative happens in one's life, this functioning level, here it is shown the functioning level drastically goes down, because that event disturbs the whole mental functioning as well as physical functionings. So, there is a decline in functioning that happens. Now, when this decline in functioning happens, with the passage of time, how that person then deals with that post-traumatic event or post-traumatic situations of the life can lead to various outcomes. For example, with the decline of the functioning, one possibility is that the person can go into something called as a succumbing stage. The person is not able to recover from that and the person is overwhelmed by the event, then that is one possible outcome which is called as a succumbing. People generally discuss concept like PTSD and other disorder which can come into this category. The person acquired certain disorder simply because the person is too much overwhelmed by the impact of the event and not able to recover immediately or at least for some time. Another possibility that happens is that the person survives, the condition is little better than the succumbing stage, but then survival is with impairment. So, the person survives, but still there is a lot of functional issues. So, that can also come under things like PTSD and so on. Okay. Here it is the symptoms may be a little less than the succumbing stage. Another possibility that happens after the decline in functioning, the person recovers and come back to the baseline functioning level or the functioning level at which the person was functioning before the event. So, this we can call as something also called recovery stage. The person completely recovers from the impact of the event, which is also technically called as resilience. One of the major idea of resilience which we have discussed elaborately in the last class is that how quickly the person is able to bounce back to the previous level of functioning after an adversity happens. So, this is the condition where when the person is able to recover to the previous level of functioning, we can call it as a condition for resilience. Now there is another possibility which happens for a lot of people after traumatic event is that they not only come back to the previous level of functioning, they in fact grow out of it. So their functioning level actually increases after the traumatic event in certain sense. It cannot be general statement, but in certain aspects of functioning, the person actually becomes better than the previous level of functioning. So the functioning level actually increases. This is a case where we can put post-traumatic growth. So these are the different possibilities which can happen after encountering a traumatic event, which may lead to different disordered stage like PTSD. Then one can also recover, which is a resilient stage, and person can also get transformed by the event itself, and the functioning level actually can increase, which is a case of post-traumatic growth. So this is just the background concepts, which are concepts related to various outcomes which can be possible, and where post-traumatic growth fits into this whole spectrum of outcomes. Now let us look into this whole concept of post-traumatic growth. Now when we talk about post-traumatic growth, some people also use the term stress-related growth, but post-traumatic growth is more appropriate and more popularly used in the literature. There are many philosophical statements which captures the gist of post-traumatic growth. For example, Nietzsche said, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." So anything that, any problem, any difficulties, any adversities in life, if it is not killing you, then it is also giving you an opportunity to make you strong, because you are facing, struggling with the difficulties, that will make you strong. Other statements like, the pain of yesterday is the strength of today. So pain gets converted into the strength. So these are the statements, some of the statements which are a common understanding in the folklores and the literature also, literature and religion also, which captures the gist of post-traumatic growth. Now what is post-traumatic growth in terms of conceptually defining it? So what happens, the research shows, in addition to experiencing various negative symptoms of the trauma and stress, like PTSD and other possible outcomes, many people also report various positive changes in their life as a result of facing traumatic event. The research shows that people obviously after traumatic event, they experience various psychological disorders. One possibility is PTSD symptoms and other things which are commonly, extensively discussed in the literature. But research also shows that many people after encountering traumatic situation, they also experience certain positive changes in their life, which are collectively called as post-traumatic growth. So these positive psychological changes experienced by people as a result of struggle with highly challenging life circumstances is known as post-traumatic growth. So this term was introduced by Tedeschi and Calhoun in 1995. First this term was coined. So any positive psychological change that is experienced by people after encountering challenging or difficult or adversities in life or traumatic events in life can be called as post-traumatic growth. Now this post-traumatic growth happens not because of trauma itself, but it happens because of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. So the people try to struggle with the difficult situation or aftermath of the situation, that struggle with the new situation, and in that process of struggling they sometimes grow out of it. So this is the conceptual definition of the term. Tedeschi and Calhoun also said that suffering and distress can be possible source of positive change. So the idea is, when we suffer or when we go through negative phases in life, that can also give a possibility for certain positive transformation also. So this is just a possibility. It is not necessarily that it will happen to everybody. So one of the main idea behind post-traumatic growth in terms of concept is that it is not just direct result of trauma, but rather related to how the individual struggles as a result of the trauma. So trauma may not directly cause post-traumatic growth. Otherwise, everybody should have experienced post-traumatic growth. It is aftermath trauma, how people deal with the situation, how they struggle with the new realities of life. That is what is the main factor that leads to post-traumatic growth or not post-traumatic growth or not experiencing post-traumatic growth. Now, when we talk about post-traumatic growth, it is not just coping with a new situation or coping with the traumatic situation, Coping is necessary, obviously some extent of coping is necessary, but it is not sufficient to achieve psychological growth or post-traumatic growth. Some level of coping is necessary, but post-traumatic growth is not just about coping, it is about some transformation that is happening. So thriving, or here it is kind of used with the term like post-traumatic growth, represents more than return to equilibrium following challenge. So the person is not only just return to the previous level, but they also move beyond the previous level of functioning, as we have shown in the diagram. Now some of the research indicate that PTG experiences are fairly common and outnumbers the report of psychiatric disorders. Research shows that these post-traumatic growth experiences, some kind of post-traumatic growth experiences are actually quite common. These are not like rare phenomena that some people experiences. Actually research shows that a lot of people actually experiences some form of post-traumatic growth. Not necessarily it has to be dramatic transformation or something like that, but some form of post-traumatic growth are very commonly experienced by people. In fact, more than the experience of the psychiatric disorders. For example, one study reported that approximately 30 to 90%, depending on the different studies, of the survivors of traumatic events reported at least some positive changes following trauma. So this is quite commonly experienced by normal individuals. So this is not something very rare. So that is why this phenomena has a lot of relevance in the life of common individuals. So this concept is not a new concept in terms of conceptual understanding. This has always been there in the understanding of human beings. Historically, every religion talks about this concept that there is a possibility of transformation after sufferings and difficulties in one's life. Philosophers have been talking about it, folklores, literature have been talking about it. So it's not a new concept in terms of concept, and all these things, religion, literature, philosophies, folklores have been emphasizing the transformative power of human sufferings and difficulties in one's life. But this is a relatively new concept in terms of empirical research in the field of psychology, where people started collecting data and asking people whether they experience post-traumatic growth. So in a more empirical, in a measurable way, this is relatively recent, not so recent, because this research has started in 1995 in terms of first coining of the term. So at least more than 2 decades have passed, and a lot of research has actually been done in this area. So in terms of empirical research, this is a relatively recent thing in the field of psychology, but conceptually this phenomena has always been there in the mind of people, in the understanding of the people, especially in the religions, in the philosophies and folklores and so on. The presence of post-traumatic growth does not mean absence of distress. Both can occur simultaneously. So this is very also important, that people, when we talk about post-traumatic growth, we are not saying that that after post-traumatic growth the person will appreciate suffering and trauma, and that he or she will not be influenced by trauma and the difficulties of life. That is not so. It is both can exist together. The person can grow, at the same time they can also suffer the consequences of the negative event in their life. So they are not like they have grown, so they will appreciate the trauma and suffering. That is not the case. Both can coexist together simultaneously. So that is one of the idea, that it is not absence of suffering, that PTG leads to absence of suffering. That may not happen. We'll see in the model also. So post-traumatic growth can be considered as an outcome as well as a process. So it is both a process as well as an outcome. People keep growing and it emerges as an outcome also. Now let us look into some of the other related concepts which are discussed in the literature or in the literature of psychology. That there are many other concepts which are very similar to post-traumatic growth, but they are technically different. Let us look into some of these concepts so that we can distinguish these terms. So one of the term is called as thriving, which sometimes is used synonymously, but technically they are different. Post-traumatic growth and thriving are different terms. So thriving is defined as the psychological state in which individuals experience both a sense of vitality and a sense of learning. So it's a state, very positive state, thriving state. The person is experiencing vitality, sense of learning and growth in one's life. So we can say that person is in a state of thriving. That means the person is experiencing vitality, growth and expansion in one's life. So that can be some of the indicators for thriving. Now Although thriving can be associated with the growth, it is more often understood as a everyday occurrence and is not normally linked to trauma. Thriving is generally used in the general sense of everyday occurrences of life. That person can thrive in the normal situations of life. It not necessarily be, person should thrive in the context of trauma. So trauma is not necessarily linked to thriving as a concept. One can thrive in the normal situations of life. This is where it differs from the concept of post-traumatic growth. In post-traumatic growth, the growth happens only after the traumatic events. So it is always discussed in the context of trauma. So PTG is always discussed in the concept of trauma or significant adversity. In thriving, it is not necessarily linked to trauma or adversity. It can happen in the normal situations of life. So this is how technically these two terms are different. Another term very similar to thriving, it is also used, called flourishing. This also technically little different from the post-traumatic growth. So as with thriving, flourishing is a broad term associated with well-being. Flourishing individuals are filled with emotional vitality, functioning positively in the private and social realms of life. Very similar term to thriving. The person is again vitality, which is similar to thriving. It is mostly used in the concept of high well-being in one's life. When a person has high well-being in one's life, we can say the person's life is flourishing. The person is functioning, experiencing life in a very positive way, functioning very positively in both personal and the social life. So we can say the person has a very flourishing life. So like thriving, flourishing and post-traumatic growth all involves positive functioning and experience. PTG is also about positive functioning and experience. All three terms are used in a positive sense of functioning and experiences of life. However, PTG occurs only after the traumatic events, whereas thriving and flourishing may or may not occur after the negative event. So that is how these three terms are different. Flourishing and thriving can happen in the normal situations of life, the normal course of life. One can flourish, not necessarily has to face trauma and other thing. So for thriving and flourishing, trauma is not necessarily be present. It can happen after trauma also, but PTG is always discussed in the context of trauma. Trauma has to be there to experience post-traumatic growth. So that's the technical difference. So PTG involves transformations that comes through struggle with post-traumatic situations. So the idea of transformation is less prominent in thriving and flourishing. Thriving and flourishing is more like somebody is expanding in life, growing in life. Transformation idea is not very specifically linked to these terms. Transformation is there is a sudden or there can be very dramatic changes in one's life suddenly because of certain event. So that is what transformation is all about. So in thriving and flourishing, not necessarily transformation word is used, or the context of transformation may not be very appropriate. It is more appropriate in the context of post-traumatic growth. Now some other terms which are also people use sometimes or get confused with the post-traumatic growth are resilience and recovery. Resilience, we have talked about it in detail in the last lecture. So I will just mention how it is different from PTG. So PTG is different from the concept of resilience. Resilience is the ability to bounce back and go on with life after hardship. So resilient people return to the baseline level of functioning. So generally when we talk about resilience in a more general sense, it is used in the context that the person is able to bounce back. So there is some negative event happens, the person here, this is the, let's say, the baseline level of functioning, then something negative happens, the person quickly returns back, So that ability to quickly return back is the concept of resilience used. In the concept of broader literature of resilience, sometimes positive transformation things are also used, but typically resilience is used in the context of returning back to the normal functioning or the previous level of functioning. Post-traumatic growth, on the other hand, is more about that person not only returns to the baseline level, the person goes above the baseline level in terms of functioning. So the person's functioning actually increases, which we have mentioned in the earlier diagram also. So PTG, on the other hand, is not about returning to the baseline, rather it is an experience of improvement that is deeply profound and significant in person's life. People find those transformations are significant and profound for a lot of people. So this is how resilience is different from post-traumatic growth. Resilience is mostly talks about stability in the context of trauma. You become stable and come back to the normal level, rather than trajectory of increased positive functioning, which is about post-traumatic growth. Now, the concept of recovery is also very similar to the resilience. Recovery also is about returning to the prior level of functioning. So, slowly people recover from some negative event and they return back. So, that process is called recovery. Again, it is not about transformation, it is not about enhancing functioning and so on, which the PTG talks about. Now, let us talk about what are the domains of post-traumatic growth in terms of how people report post-traumatic growth. What are the areas in which people report post-traumatic growth, or after the trauma, what kind of growth people experiences. From the research on various research shows that there could be 5 possible domains of post-traumatic growth, that people report growth in 5 possible dimensions. The first dimension is an increased appreciation of life in general. Now, it may look counterintuitive or paradoxical in a sense that after traumatic event, why people would appreciate life. Now, if you think about it, in certain traumatic events can actually increase the appreciation of life, especially when people come back from near-death experiences, let's say fatal accident, or person survive some chronic illnesses like cancer, or some almost people generally associate death with such kind of diseases that it is difficult to come back, and let's say people come back from such situation or recover from such situation. People report increased appreciation for life because they realize, a lot of people, what they report is that they realize the importance of life when they face death and then come back. Now they understand that life can be very transitory, it can go at any time. So the value of life increases. They start enjoying small things of their life, feelings of being lucky, and they make best of their whatever the remaining time they have. So in that sense, sometimes some negative event, traumatic event makes certain transformation in the mindset of people in terms of increasing appreciation for life. They see the life in more newer perspective. Earlier they might have taken so many things for granted. Now they may think that all that small things of their life can be more important. They may give more importance to the emotional aspects of their life, relationship, and so on. So in a general sense, people can report increased appreciation of life in general after traumatic event. For some people, this can be a transformative experience in terms of shift in their thought processes. Second possible dimension is more intimate and meaningful relationship with other. A lot of people report that after traumatic event, their relationship with other people or some individuals become much more deeper and meaningful. Now this, we could understand that many times we understand the value of relationship or value of other individuals in one's life only when we face certain difficulties in life. It is only in the difficult situation you come to know who are your real friends, who are your real relatives, and who are just fake people in terms of just not very deeply connected to you. Traumatic events actually teaches that lesson. So people realize the importance of some people after traumatic event, or it is only in the situation of trauma that people realize the importance of some people in their life, and their connection become much deeper, much more intimate with those people, because they realize the role of these people in their life much more when negative situation happens in one's life. Because when everything goes well, people could be just around you and be around you, and they can be supporting you and so on. But it is only difficult situation when you see the real people and the people who are having meaningful relationship with you. So people report they realize the importance of relationship after traumatic event, finding the real friends, increased sense of compassion and empathy. Sometimes people also develop more compassion and empathy after traumatic events because they realize what kind of difficulties they faced, and when they see similar situation faced by other people, they can understand what they are going through. So their perspective also grows, their sense of compassion and empathy also grows. So these are the things which certain changes which could be positive are also experienced by people after traumatic event. The third dimension in which people report PTG is sense of personal strength. Now, this is something which is very commonly we can connect with the concept of post-traumatic growth, that people become much more stronger when they face problems in their life. People don't become strong psychologically if they only face situations which are very comfortable. From the comfort of life, people don't grow. People grow only when they face difficulties and adversities in their life, because at that time all the potentials comes out. So sense of personal strength are reported by a lot of people after traumatic events in terms of realizing their hidden capabilities. They come out best when in the adversities of life, and potentials, increase the ability to deal and handle things. All these things you realize when you face certain situations which are difficult. In ordinary situation, a lot of capabilities and strengths are not required as such. They are only necessary when some difficult situation arises and those potentials comes out, and people realize I can do this also. They were not at all aware that they had those capacities. So this is called sense of personal strength. The fourth dimension is new possibilities for one's life. Many people find new dimensions or possibilities in their life, new direction in their life after traumatic events. In terms of like they've completely changed the pathways of their life, completely changed the career and so on after certain traumatic event. So a lot of this also examples we can find out for people who experience certain traumatic event and then they take a career path which are related to this traumatic event. For example, somebody survives cancer and they realize what kind of troubles and problems a cancer patient can go through, and if that person recovers from that, probably they will change their whole path of life and career in terms of they may devote their rest of their life in terms of helping people who are experiencing or who are going through cancer and so on, simply because of their life experiences. So that event actually changed their career path or the perspective of life or the path of their life. So a lot of people who are seriously doing social work and so on, they create NGOs and so on. A lot of these people could have they develop this whole idea of helping people. It could be very much linked to their personal life stories also. So many times they get this idea of helping certain kind of people simply because they face those situations in their own life. So that transforms them and they completely change their career paths and so on. So in terms of traumatic events, sometimes can create new possibilities for one's life, which you are not at all thinking before the event. The fifth possibility or the dimensions of post-traumatic growth is called spiritual and existential growth. Now, spiritual growth has always been linked to traumatic events, sufferings of life and so on. People ask deeper questions in life only when they go through difficulties in life. They will always ask, why me? Why it is happening to me? So people engage with the existential and the deeper questions and the spiritual aspects of life when they go through difficulties in life generally. Not necessarily it has to happen like that, but for a lot of people they become the depth of their personality increases when the traumatic event happens or difficult situation happens in their life. So a lot of people actually go into the spiritual path also when they face difficulties and traumatic situations in life, where they ask deeper questions in life, why this, what is the meaning of all these things and so on. And in that sense we can say they grow spiritually. For many people it can happen like that. So the spiritual and existential growth can express in terms of greater engagement with the existential questions, like what is the meaning of all this, what is the meaning of life and so on, newer insight into the existential problem and so on. So these are 5 dimensions in which people report post-traumatic growth. Most of the reports of people can be subsumed into these 5 categories. Now let us look into the empirical research findings in terms of what kind of events or traumatic events leads to post-traumatic growth. Now research suggests that PTG is a very common experience. People report some form of PTG after traumatic event. A lot of people, not everybody. For individual after traumatic event. In general, it has been claimed that the nature of the event itself is less important for post-traumatic growth than the way the individual experiences it. So traumatic event itself is not that important determined, but it is how the person deals with that event, how the person interprets the event, because that is what leads to growth, not the event itself. That is why everybody may not grow out of it. It depends on how that person is perceiving the event and the dealing with that event. So the research has indicated PTG can happen from diverse traumatic events. Some of the events are listed here. People report post-traumatic growth after different kind of personnel losses, such as bereavement, when people are in a state of bereavement after death of someone, or those kind of situations, when people go through medical problems, when go through people interpersonal violations such as rape and other forms of sexual assault, community traumas such as natural disaster and so on. So these are some of the examples that PTG can happen to all kinds of traumatic events. The research also indicated that work-related traumatic experience can also lead to PTG. So the earlier events were mostly in general traumatic event, but work-related traumatic experiences can also lead to post-traumatic growth. PTG research remains very surprisingly small in the context of work and organizational life. Not much research is available. However, a small body of research explored PTG in certain job contexts which are more vulnerable for traumatic situations. Some jobs on work situations are very traumatic. That job itself is not easy. We have to face a lot of trauma. So inherently traumatic work and job includes things like military or defense sector, where people have to face a lot of traumatic situation on a daily basis. They encounter death, they encounter accidents and so on. So they have to deal with a lot of traumatic events on a daily basis. So that the work itself can be very traumatic, and people report PTG in such work situation also. Military, police, these are all defense related job which can be very traumatic for such people. People who work in emergency services like firefighters and so on, or even in the medical emergencies and so on, they have to face deaths and the pain of people on a daily basis. Such people also report PTG because of the traumatic events they experience in the work itself. People who work in the disaster and rescue work, some of the research indicates that people experience PTG in all this work related situation also. So all this work related situation can also prompt negative experiences in terms of PTSD. It can also lead to PTG. So it is not necessarily that everybody in those situations will experience PTG, but research shows that there is also possibility of PTG in all these workplaces also. There is a possibility of disorder also. So it all depends on the persons, and some of the factors we'll talk about in the model. Sometimes secondary trauma at work can also lead to PTG. Secondary trauma in sense, you don't experience trauma yourself, but you look at other people's and like you witness trauma in others' life, which could be related to some of the jobs that we already discussed. So these are called secondary trauma. Secondary or vicarious trauma is a regular part of job of professionals whose work can be traumatizing because it involves supporting others, because the job itself is to support traumatized people only. Some of these things we have already discussed. So research indicated PTG among health professionals such as labor and delivery nurses, psychotherapists, social workers, interpreters, clergy, and funeral directors. This posts are there in a lot of these Western countries where there are funeral directors and so on. So these are the job situations where you may encounter or see traumas in others' life a lot on a daily basis. So that is basically you are experiencing secondary trauma, not trauma on yourself, but trauma you are witnessing trauma in others' life. In many of these cases, PTG can also be experienced. PTG is linked to the change and growth that workers witness in their clients. So they see PTG in other clients, and that can also stimulate growth in themselves, which prompts in those workers a new appreciation for what is possible in terms of the difference they can facilitate. In some cases, it may prompt a spiritual broadening and so on. So when they witness PTG in other people, that they see when the people are going through so much of difficulties, and they also grow out of it. That can also stimulate growth in the people who are witnessing them. So in such cases, empathic engagement with the client facilitates secondary PTG. Thus witnessing PTG in others can itself be a positive transformative experience. Sometimes when you see other people growing out of trauma, that can give you a lesson to us also. So we can learn from their life. That can also stimulate growth in people. Now let us look at some of the models of PTG. How can we explain this whole process? One of the most popular model that is discussed in the literature is proposed by Tedeschi and Calhoun in 2004. So they are the ones who proposed this, initiated the research in this field and coined the term post-traumatic growth. So they gave a model which is called as a functional descriptive model to explain this whole process of post-traumatic growth, why it happens, what are the factors that can facilitate this whole process of PTG and so on. So we'll talk about this model and one more model to understand this whole process of post-traumatic growth. So Tedeschi and Calhoun in 2004 proposed this functional descriptive model to explain this process of PTG. In their model, they used a metaphor of earthquake to explain this process of PTG. So they used a metaphor of earthquake to explain how PTG happens. So they proposed that traumatic events are like seismic events that shatters our assumptive world. Shatters our assumptive world, just like earthquake shatters physical structures. So they used a metaphor of earthquake, which is a seismic event, that when earthquake happens, it destroys the structures in the physical world, buildings and so on. Similarly, when a traumatic event happens, it is like an earthquake in one's mental world. Trauma is like an earthquake in the mental world. Now in the physical world, earthquake destroys structures. In the mental world, it destroys mental structures. What are those mental structures? These are called assumptive world. Our assumptions of life, our belief systems, our future expectations, all these are assumptive world. We have many assumptions about ourselves, our future, about other people and so on. A lot of these assumptions are destroyed by traumatic event. For example, one might think that one's life is very secure and well, fine, but let's say the whole source of security was coming from someone in their life and suddenly that person dies. What will happen to this assumption? It will completely be shattered. Now your whole assumptions of life, a secure life, a good life, everything will vanish with the death of that person with whom this was linked. So your whole assumptive world will get destroyed. So that is how traumatic event destroys and shatters assumptive world, just like earthquake destroys physical structures. So this assumptive world includes assumptions, beliefs about our life and world, which gives meaning and purpose and guides behavior. All this can be shattered by traumatic events. Okay? So this threat and shattering of assumptive world gives rise to significant psychological distress. And the moment a lot of this assumption get destroyed, we experience it as a distress. We experience a lot of pain, sufferings, because we cannot make sense of a lot of things that is happening after that event. It is difficult to come in terms of that. And that experience is distress, pain, suffering and so on. So they extended this metaphor that what happens after the earthquake, obviously it destroys all the structures and buildings and so on. What do we do after that? We try to rebuild. The physical rebuilding that takes place after the trauma. So generally physical rebuilding are designed to be more resistant to shock in future. So what happens as a learning experience, as a rational human being, what we do after earthquakes? If something gets destroyed, we try to rebuild it again so that it is more resistant to future shocks. We rebuild it in a much stronger way from our learning experience, because earthquake can destroy it. So we try to build to our best of possibilities to make it more resistant to future shocks. Similarly, in the mental world, when this trauma destroys your assumptive world, slowly you cannot remain there. We tend to rebuild it again. Now this rebuilding, cognitive rebuilding that takes place after the trauma produces schemas that incorporate the trauma and possible events in the future and that are more resistant to being shattered. Now when you rebuild your mental world again, your mental world will be more resistant to future shocks, because now this experience of shock is already included in the mental structure. Now you know this can happen also. So it is much more resistant to future shocks. So this is what leads to the post-traumatic growth experiences, that you incorporate many traumatic event itself and as a learning experience. So this is an analogy, this is a like metaphor they used to explain broadly how it can be explained. Now here they are saying PTG is not the direct outcome of trauma, it is the struggle with the new realities. They are focusing on it again and again. It is not the event that causes growth, it is your perception, your way of dealing that is more important. Now this, they have elaborately discussed various factors that could lead to post-traumatic growth. We'll talk about their model a little bit. This was the analogy that we used, but their model has many factors and many things. Very briefly, their model is about, it will start from here. So the seismic event happens, so easily uncontrollable, potentially irreversible, threatening. So that means seismic event means traumatic event that happens to a person. After that event, the individual's way of understanding the world is challenged, shaken and shattered. So a lot of this assumptive world gets shattered as we have discussed. Then the person, cognitive engagement happens. The person tries to understand what happens, various thought processes. The person asks various questions, why me, why this is happening, and try to cognitively engage in terms of trying to make sense of the event. So the individual cognitively engages in the two domains particularly. One is making sense of the event, they try to understand what is this happening, it may take time. So making sense, and second, making sense of the meaning of the event to his or her life. Event itself they have to make sense, and then they try to make sense of the implication of the event in their life. So they try to engage, and that can be very painful process because new realities you have to build again, and so the cognitive engagement is very important. Generally everybody goes through that. Then further cognitive processing happens. Now this can be facilitated here by disclosure, support and narratives. So if you have supportive people around you, they will also tell you a lot of comforting things and so on. The more you disclose and talk to people about the problems that you are going through, you are more likely to get support, the better support system you have. So all these things will influence your life narratives. How do you explain your life? So individuals reconsiders the basic assumptions about who they are, what people around them are like, what kind of world they live in, what future they hold, and so on. All these things, the more they talk about it, disclose, and better support system they have, social support, this will facilitate all these processes of coming in terms with the new realities of life. And this will facilitate reconstruction of the shattered assumptions. So if these things are present, the person are more likely to rebuild their destroyed mental world or shattered assumptions with new beliefs, new life goals and so on. And that is what we are talking about as PTG or post-traumatic growth. So this is in a lump sum way of summarizing their model. Their actual model looks like this. So it is very similar to what we have discussed. Only thing is that specific variables names are here. So this is a model what we have already discussed, the processes. So that seismic event which creates so many challenges in one's life, management of emotional distress, belief goals, narrative, all these are destroyed. So the person has to, the challenges in front of person is to manage all these things. Now this is distress happens. One of the reasons for is rumination, means people keep thinking about it, why this has happened. So that uncontrolled thought process is called rumination. Initially this process is very automatic and intrusive, you cannot control it. Thoughts keeps coming and so on, and you are not able to switch it off. Slowly with the passage of time, there is a reduction of emotional distress, management of automatic thoughts. So people slowly disengage, and with the passage of time they are able to settle back a little bit. And then this rumination initially, which was very automatic and intrusive, it becomes more deliberate, more conscious, and that can lead to schema change, narrative development and so on. And this is facilitated by self-disclosure, means the more you talk about it, write about it, process about it, it will facilitate this automatic rumination to more conscious rumination, thought processes, narrative development, which is essential for post-traumatic growth to happen. Now here in the later model they included something called as a socio-cultural factors can also facilitate post-traumatic growth. So what they are saying, that not only your own self-disclosure and other thing, but what kind of socio-cultural environment you have, that will also facilitate post-traumatic growth in terms of reducing emotional distress, automatic rumination and so on. So socio-cultural factors can include proximate factors and distal factor, we will talk about it a little bit. So this was included in the later updated model, and this how rumination, when it becomes more conscious and you settle back, new narrative change happens, that is experienced as a PTG here. The sub processes what we have summarized earlier also, but more specific variables names are here. And they are also saying this distress can coexist with that. So here distress and PTG can remain together. PTG can also be equated with narrative and wisdom development. So person become wiser and so on. Now let us look at this whole socio-cultural thing that they talked about. So basically these are what again summarizing the processes, social support, self-disclosure, everything can lead to post-traumatic growth, especially when this distressing phase happens after the event and this intense cognitive processes starts. And this supportive network, everything can help in cognitive processing and managing all these emotions. The socio-cultural influence they have, which they updated based on cultural research and so on, they said these two factors can be there in socio-cultural influences which can shape PTG. One is proximate socio-cultural influences. These are immediate and direct factors which are there around us. Like these are close, personal, immediate influences that affects how an individual processes trauma and fosters. This may include your family and friends, community and social networks, healthcare and mental health services and so on, whether these things are available or not. So these factors of support of family, friends, community, social network, healthcare system and so on, the presence of them, these are all proximate factor, whether these are present in your socio-cultural environment or not. So they will also facilitate, if they are present, they will facilitate your post-traumatic growth processes. And then the second factor is called distal socio-cultural influences. These are broad and indirect factors which are there in the culture itself. So these are larger societal and cultural factors that shape beliefs and values about trauma and resilience. This may include things like cultural narratives and belief system towards suffering, resilience and personal growth. What is there in your culture, how your culture looks at sufferings, trauma and so on. So for example, a lot of religion may look at suffering as a normal thing of life. For example, Buddhist culture, suffering, the main principles of Buddhism is that life is suffering. No? So there is a natural sense of acceptance could be there because it is already ingrained in their culture. So these cultural narratives, belief system, broader belief system which you imbibe from the society and culture, they can all influence how do you process the trauma and so on, and whether it leads to growth or not. Religious and spiritual framework attached to adversity, how your religion look at adversities, that will also influence how we process it. Even social and economic conditions, economic stability, education, public policies that can influence coping resources and so on. So these are all broader indirect factors which could be in our mind and influence our processing system. They can also influence whether PTG happens or not. So these socio-cultural factors can be very important player in terms of whether PTG happens or not. So the most important thing is that after the traumatic event, those automatic ruminative thoughts should change to reflective thoughts which are conscious and deliberate. Initially it becomes ruminative thoughts, then slowly with the supportive system, the factors that we discussed, it can change to reflective thoughts, leading to newer schema and the new narrative development. Then the new understanding, rebuilding of schema, everything happens which leads to PTG. If this is not happening, then PTG will not happen. So PTG is closely connected to the development of wisdom, which is in another term. So in a general, this whole understanding and the learning process, we can equate it as a development of wisdom. So PTG may not remove your pain, but enduring distress may coexist. So there can be distress and growth happening side by side. So this is one of the most prominent or popular model in the literature that explains the process of PTG, how it happens. There is another model which talks about PTG in terms of why PTG happens, under what conditions, and under what condition PTSD happens. So that is also called as an organismic valuing theory of PTG. It was proposed by Joseph and Linley in 2005, and it is called as an organismic valuing theory of growth through adversity. So this model also provides some explanation, some alternative explanation why PTG happens for some people and why some people develop PTSD and disorder and so on. So based on the principles of humanistic psychology, it suggests that human beings have inherent tendencies towards growth and actualization. So one of the foundational principles of this model is that human beings are growth oriented. Everybody wants to grow in their life. No one wants to experience stagnation and going backward. No one wants that. It may happen because of certain situation, but intrinsically everybody wants growth and expansion in their life. So that's the humanistic principle. So PTG is inconsistent with that. Even if difficulties happens, people wants to grow out of it. So this is a natural tendency within all of us. So inconsistency with these tendencies, they show intrinsic motivation to rebuild the assumptive world in an aftermath of trauma. So people try to rebuild their life in such a way that they want to grow out of it, because the tendency is inherent within all of us. So this tendency actually leads to growth. So they suggested that there can be three possible cognitive outcomes after traumatic event. So they says after traumatic event there can be three possibilities. One is called assimilation, which help to return to pre-trauma baseline level. So assimilation means you just add information that your life was going in certain way, some event happened, and it doesn't change you mentally. You just add one more information to your mind. Okay, XYZ event has happened to me. So that is called assimilation. You just add one more information to your whole scheme of things. You don't change yourself, but there is no transformation. Then you just return to your pre-trauma baseline level. You just return back. So which can be called as resilience and so on. So there can be accommodation, but negative accommodation. Now accommodation means your whole scheme of things changes. The whole perspective of looking at things changes. So your interpretation, your schemas, everything changes, transforms. But it transforms in the negative direction. So some negative event happens, your whole perspective of life changes. But it is in the negative direction. Means you become hopeless and you see all the negative things that happens, because which can be very common after traumatic event. So those negative accommodation can result in psychopathology such as PTSD. But this accommodation can happen in the positive direction also, that can result in PTG. That means some mental transformation happens, changes happens, your perspective changes, but it is in the positive direction. You look at new possibilities and so on, whatever dimension we talked about. Then all this, if it happens in those direction, it can lead to PTG. So this theory also has laid emphasis on social environment such as facilitator of actualizing tendency that is essentially needed for growth. So if social environment promotes those tendencies of growth, then it will be people who are more likely to experience PTG to happen, or that positive accommodation will happen. Now let us look into some findings. There are so many empirical findings available, how PTG is linked to well-being. So in general, it appears that reports of PTG, especially when maintained, predict better subsequent well-being. So most of the literature or findings shows that PTG leads to better well-being, or well-being dimension increases. Disaster workers who experience post-traumatic growth tend to feel they have gained in self-esteem, sense of accomplishment and meaningfulness in their work, and a better understanding of the work. So this is one research that shows how PTG can be linked to some dimensions of well-being, particularly eudynamic well-being. In a meta-analysis of 87 cross-sectional studies related to PTG and health outcomes, growth was found to be positively related to measures of well-being, including self-esteem, life satisfaction, and negatively related to depression and so on. So at least most of the research indicates that PTG may lead to higher well-being. Now, that doesn't mean the distress will not be there. Only thing is that various indicators of well-being, like most of them are in the eudynamic dimensions. People experience of well-being can increase with the PTG happening side by side. Now PTG has been equated with the wisdom. That means PTG dimensions are almost same as development of new wisdom in one's life. So wisdom is generally considered as a psychosocial maturity that integrates cognitive, reflective and emotional personality traits. So wisdom is mostly considered as some kind of maturity that happens in the cognitive, reflective, emotional aspects of oneself. So one becomes mature in those dimensions, then we can say the person is becoming wiser. So the concept of wisdom often invokes stereotypical image of old wise men. So we generally typical understanding of wisdom is that as people become older, they become wiser. With the idea that they have experienced so many things in their life and they have learned many things and they have become wiser. So wisdom accumulates through life experiences, and it has been reported that age affects the depth of wisdom and the life wisdom advances with aging. Research also indicates that with the passage of time and as age progresses, wisdom also generally increases. Now, wisdom can be differentiated from PTG. Wisdom is a broader concept that can be found across the life span of human development and is not restricted to the post-traumatic situation. Again, wisdom is a very broad term which can develop out of the different life experiences, not necessarily just traumatic events. So again, PTG is not conceptually same as wisdom. Wisdom is a more broader term which can happen across the lifespan from various experiences of life, and it is not restricted to trauma. Trauma can be one of the indicators. So wisdom may develop through traumatic experiences, but it is not necessarily restricted to it. So this is how conceptually these two terms are also different. But a lot of the dimensions of PTG are equated as if it is like person has become wiser. So PTG was equated and co-varied with the development of wisdom in the model, as we have discussed, model of Tedeschi and Calhoun 2004. In fact, domains of PTG are aspects of wisdom only, but conceptually the terms are little different. Although both PTG and wisdom have been conceptually linked, there is not much empirical studies available linking PTG and wisdom, not much empirical available, but conceptually they are different. The domains are very synonymous, like the dimensions of wisdom, we can say. Now at the end, let us talk about how can we facilitate post-traumatic growth. Some of the factors was already discussed in the functional descriptive model, which shows that what can facilitate PTG. Now let us look into more detail some of the other broader factors. If they are present in one's life, the person is more likely to experience PTG after the traumatic events. So Tedeschi and Calhoun 2006 suggested that post-traumatic growth is facilitated by expert companionship. So they used a term called expert companionship. If that is present, then PTG is more likely to happen after the traumatic events. So these expert companions are people who can listen to extended periods and repeatedly to stories that can involve horror, fear, guilt, shame and confusion. Expert companions cannot prescribe post-traumatic growth. Now these are the people who can empathetically listen to the stories of people, whatever, the traumas they face, the stories of horror, fear, guilt, shame, confusion. If people after going through traumatic event, if they can express all these things to someone, we can call that person as an expert companionship. And it can facilitate PTG to happen. So they facilitate it through kind and empathic listening. They may be professionals, friends or family. It could be anybody, it could be somebody professional or a counselor. It could be a friend or family who, if such people are present, then generally PTG is more likely to happen. So this is one important factor. They also talked about some other factors that Calhoun and Tedeschi outlines, more specifically 5 ways to facilitate PTG. One is about education. Education not in a typical sense of education. They are talking about, in order to facilitate growth, it is important to understand and educate oneself about the trauma, how it is caused and disruptions of the core beliefs. So if you understand what this trauma is doing to you in terms of, if you have more insights about the impact of the trauma, if you can educate yourself how it can impact you, if you know more about the impact of trauma and how it impacts you, how you are able to cope with this and so on. So education in that sense. That can come from the life experiences, that can come if somebody can also talk about it and so on. You can also read about it in some books and so on. So that those things they are called in as education. The more you understand the traumas, different aspects to it, how it is impacting you, how can you cope with that? This all can be called as an education, and it will help you to facilitate, grow out of those situations. So it is important to make sense of the trauma and understand that when traumatic event shatters our life assumption, it is painful, confusing and frightening, and may lead to anxiety and repetitive thinking about the traumatic event, such as why did this happen to me, what should I do now, and so on. This is a very natural process of happening. So all this education will help you to make sense of the event, and the more you are able to make sense of the event, more you are likely to come back and grow out of it. So processing trauma in this way is normal and may stimulate growth. Expert companion may facilitate this educational process. So expert companion will be a protective factor in all these factors, will be connected to that. So education can come from expert companions, maybe friends, family and counselors, whoever, depending on the situation. They can also facilitate this factor. Second is emotion regulation. Obviously, this is very important. If you cannot regulate your emotions after the trauma, it will linger for a very long time. So learning to regulate emotions and reduce psychological distress is crucial for PTG. Obviously, some disturbance and some impact of trauma is necessary for transformation, but if the person is too much overwhelmed by it, it will lead to PTSD and other problems. But at least to some level of regulation is necessary to process it consciously. So managing negative emotions help us to come to our senses and right frame of mind for deliberate and reflective thinking, which is very important. So some level of management of emotion is very important so that you can come to your senses, right frame of mind to look at it consciously, what is happening, and reflect on these things. So that is very important. Reflective thinking is very important for PTG. So one needs to engage in constructive coping, such as shifting thinking from loss, failures, uncertainties of success, possibilities, available resources to deal with the situation and so on. So whatever helps you to regulate emotions, constructive coping, shifting thinking, all these things, acceptance and so on. So varieties of things that can be done to regulate emotions. If they are present, that will facilitate. Coping strategies such as social support, breathing exercise, meditation, all these things can be helpful. Anything that helps you to regulate emotions can facilitate post-traumatic growth. Third factor is self-disclosure, which was very elaborately listed on the model or functional descriptive model. It is always good to talk about what has happened and is happening, what you are struggling with and so on. Such self-disclosure helps in processing of the trauma and help finding solution to the problems and increases the possibility of receiving support. So more you are likely to disclose what is going on in your mind after the trauma, the better you will feel relief. You will be able to kind of get out of a lot of this emotional turmoil, and you are more likely to get support of people. If you don't talk about it, people are not likely to support you because they may not know what is going on. So social support is very strongly linked with the self-disclosure. So the more you talk about it, more you process about it. Even research shows that even if you cannot find trustworthy people to talk about it, you can write about it in whatever experiences you have. That also helps you to process it and process the information and make it more conscious process. All these things can facilitate meaning making and reflective thinking, which is crucial for PTG. It helps you to make sense of the event and become more conscious of what is going on, and that is more important for PTG to happen. Again, here also expert companions, which can be connected to all the aspects, can facilitate this process by encouraging trauma survivors to disclose details about their experiences, what they can begin to work together and understand, etc. So self-disclosure is the form of writing also. Sometimes diary writing and other forms of writing can also facilitate PTG. If let's say there are no trustworthy people to talk about it, even writing about it can be helpful. The fourth one is narrative development. Narrative is about how do you describe your life in terms of how do you, it kind of discloses your perspective of looking at your own life. So rebuilding of our cognitive structures on assumptive world is connected to narrative development. So rebuilding or reconfiguring core life assumptions and beliefs and life story into a coherent narrative is crucial for PTG. So are you able to develop again a cohesive narrative, new narrative after the event? That is what reflects for PTG in terms of narratives. These new versions of the life narrative will incorporate some of these domains of PTG. If they incorporate, then the PTG will happen. So if your perspective changes positively, you look at the meaning of relationship in a positive light and so on. So your new life narratives, if they include some of the dimensions of PTG, then you are more likely to experience, it will translate into PTG. The development of coherent life narratives is crucial in order to proceed to the next chapter of life. Otherwise, we may be stuck with the event and older narratives. So if you stuck with the older narratives of life, you will remain there. You have to rebuild your narratives, a new narrative which incorporates the new realities of life, then it will lead to PTG. So narrative development is very important. Again, it can be facilitated by expert companions as discussed earlier. The last one is about service. PTG is facilitated by serving, benefiting and helping other close people, community and especially trauma victims similar to themselves. Sometimes people can grow, as we have already seen, experience PTG when they also help other people. So people also grow when they serve, benefit and help other people, especially people who are going through similar traumatic situations. That by looking at other people's life and so on can also stimulate growth and so on. So sometimes service and helping other people of the similar situation can be a stimulant for growth to experience. So these are some of the things about post-traumatic growth. We have discussed and tried to understand the various dimensions of it and some of the possibilities in or factors which can facilitate post-traumatic growth in our life. So with this I stop here. Thank you.